So thank you very much for having me. I want to thank Maura and Lisa and everybody at VOX-Pol's made this a great experience. You know, I was really hoping there would be something relevant in the news that I could talk about today. So I guess I'm going to have to make do. My topic is going to be the post-ISIS challenge on social media. And, you know, we've obviously spent a great deal of time and energy and money researching the innovative tactics that ISIS has brought to the social media arena. And these tactics are not unique to ISIS. They are ultimately something, ISIS has been the pioneer. They've been the first ones to really do this effectively, but they are certainly not going to be the last ones. And I want to talk a little bit about how social media itself facilitates these kinds of extremist movements and what we should be thinking about as ISIS's influence declines, what's going to come next. So I start off, my opening example here is the Flat Earth Society. The Flat Earth Society, I'm sure some of you have heard of it, they believe what their name says, the Earth is flat. They have thousands of likes on Facebook. They have thousands of followers on Twitter. Many of these people are serious about believing the Earth is flat, even though they're accessing Twitter on a mobile phone that uses a satellite that's orbiting the planet. So the Flat Earth Society has been around for a long time. This isn't a new thing. This is a fringe belief that has lingered for many years. But what we're seeing now is that there's this kind of sudden surge of new interest in it. And I think that we can, you know, really start to think about this in terms of what social media does for communities who are outside the mainstream. So these are a few examples of fringe movements that have some kind of presence on social media. The Republic for the United States is a sovereign citizen shadow government in the US. They have 5,000 likes on Facebook. They have hundreds of members, some of whom are potentially violent, others who are just happy to clog the court system with fake documents. The American Nazi Party has 9,000 followers, and I'm going to be publishing soon a more extended look at some white nationalism and Nazi activity on Twitter. If you use Twitter, you probably run into some of that already. David Icke believes that reptilian aliens have taken over the leaders of the United States and the world community as part of a Rothschild conspiracy. He has 150,000 followers on Twitter. He has 745,000 likes on Facebook. Some of these are ironic, which I know because when I went to his Facebook page, I saw some of my friends were following him, and I'm pretty sure they don't believe that reptilians are running the world. InfoWars, which is, I'm sure most of you probably heard of it, but it's a right-wing conspiracy site that is incredibly influential among American extremists. 106,000 followers on Twitter and 454,000 likes on Facebook. Some of those are Russian bots that are designed to pump up people who look freaky, but a lot of those people are legitimate followers who have a real interest in this. So this is a Venn diagram of the American Nazi Party, which is in turquoise, and the Flat Earth Organization, which is in pink. They both have about the same number of followers. What this shows is that they have, out of the 10,000 followers that each of these have, there are about 12 in common. So the idea that this is just like cool kids who follow freaky stuff, you know, is not applied to this. These groups are, there's overlap depending on how similar somebody's beliefs are, the kind of ideology they're into, but it's not like all the stupid people. There's 10,000 stupid people on Twitter and they're all following these couple stupid accounts. They are separate groups of stupid or otherwise misinformed people who are independently pursuing their interests, pursuing their dreams. So the Flat Earth Society got a big boost recently. The line's a little light for this screen, but what you can see is that starting in about June, there's a rapper named B.O.B. Bob who suddenly decided to declare his support for flat eartherism, resulting in a gigantic spike in followers. So the Flat Earth Society was, running around 400 followers on Twitter for a very long time, and all of a sudden they have 5,000 followers. You've got Bob, is now a prominent supporter, Tila Tequila, who's probably one of the 12 people who overlap between that Nazi and Flat Earth Society diagram, has also come out in support. And what this really kind of illustrates is just how quickly things can change in this environment. There's every fringe belief that you can imagine can be found somewhere online. And, I'm going to use an example that if any of you have heard me speak before, you've heard me use this example. But if you were a radical Druid living in Peoria, Illinois in the United States in 1950, you would go your whole life without ever meeting another radical Druid. Now, in the current environment, that same person can get online and can be planting trees with friends in a matter of a couple of days. Anything that you're really interested in, you can find a couple dozen or a couple hundred or a couple thousand people who share that interest. So, these numbers are relatively small. On Twitter, we're talking about 310 million monthly active users. On Facebook, we're talking upward of 1.5 billion. And the support that these groups get is objectively tiny. So the Flat Earth Society, its followers represent 4 1,000ths of 1% of all Twitter active users, which is basically statistically zero. Similarly, the American Nazi Party was at 0.003%. InfoWars is much stronger showing, but it's still 0.034%. These are tiny, tiny, tiny fractions of the overall online community. The issue is that you only need to hit that tiny fraction to create a massive disruption in society. And the example of that is ISIS. So peak ISIS on Twitter, and let me just say a few words, because a lot of the presentations I've been listening to have rightly pointed out that what happens on social media is not a complete picture of what's happening in the world. Our focus, obviously, this conference is on online extremism, so we're heavily focused on that. But what's happening online is increasingly a very good proxy for what's happening in the outside world. And increasingly, even if all members of a movement are not online, enough members of the movement are online to get the benefits of being on social media. So when social media first came on the scene back in the early 2000s, and for several years, I was kind of a skeptic about the rhetoric that was being said about it. People talked about it's going to change the world. I sort of looked at it and said, well, this Jihadi Propaganda is really the same stuff that they did offline. They're just doing it online now, and it's not such a big difference. I was terribly, terribly wrong about that, and I'm going to talk about why. What happens online is having a tremendous impact on the world. You can argue for correlation or causation, and I think what you're going to see in this talk is an argue for causation. But if you understand the environment, if you know what you're doing, you're not just like plugging in a hashtag and say, oh, look, this hashtag did great, so something's happening. But if you understand the environment, you understand the populations that you're looking at and what kind of social media they use and how they use it, this is a remarkable tool for seeing what's going on and for coordinating things that happen offline. So ISIS is a really good example of this because they were really the first extremist group to take an industrial approach to social media. They created large social media teams, thousands of users, who worked in synchronized ways, starting in about 2013 and then becoming very visible in 2014. And, the social media piece has played a huge part in the foreign fighter flows. Some online recruiting happens, but what we see is that, especially from the West, those fighters are almost always on social media. At some point, they're going to the internet, they're going to social media to find out more about the group and to make the social contacts that let them get into the group. And ISIS has created an incredible disruption for the region and the world. And when you look at their user base on here, and this is much larger than their user base in the real world, but on Twitter, at their peak, they were about 1/100th, 1.6/100ths of 1% of the overall user base. So these tiny percentages can translate into objectively large numbers when you're talking about populations as big as this. You have a 300 million population, you have 1.5 million on Facebook, and you have 7 billion people in the world. This is a tiny fraction of any of those populations is objectively a very large number of people. And if they are acting in a coordinated manner, 10,000 people acting in a coordinated fashion can create an incredible disruption. 10,000 people in a relatively confined geographical space, like a city or a county, 10,000 people in the middle of a city protesting will shut that city down. So, these tiny percentages are translating into real world effects. So, the question is what's new here? And, as I said, my initial reading of this was, Inspire magazine came out and I said, Inspire magazine's not new. People here know this. I mean, newspaper editors didn't. But, their English language jihadi magazines been around for years. Full color, beautifully designed magazines, been in circulation in print in the 80s and the 90s. And it's the same for all of these different kinds of movements. So when I was growing up and I was a teenager, I read a lot of UFO books. I was really into it. I could get that stuff. I didn't have an internet, but I had a library, and the library had those books in it, and I read them, and I was really obsessed with them for a while. There's people like me who made the X-Files a success. Similarly, one thing that was read I grew up in a fairly rural area of Pennsylvania, and my friends and I like to read Soldier of Fortune magazine. So if you follow far-right movements in the United States, Soldier of Fortune is like a huge incubator of that stuff. It's nominally a magazine for mercenaries, which is why we were reading it, because we were like, 12 years old and we figured we're going to be badass mercenaries when we grow up. That didn't work out, but but there was a lot of other stuff in there. There was a lot of conspiracy theories. There's a lot of right-wing, anti-communist kind of propaganda. And, I found it. I heard about this somehow. It was on a newsstand. You could order it. The radical ideas got out. They would get out in simple, organic ways. They would get out in very organized ways. So the Afghan jihad, comparable number of fighters went to Afghanistan that had gone to Syria. Syria is now outstripping Afghanistan, but this was a significant number. It took place more slowly. It took place over 10 years instead of over 4 years. But upwards of 20,000 foreign fighters went to Afghanistan, including probably a couple hundred Americans. And the word got out through videotapes. They had videotapes. They would take them to community centers. They would take them to mosques. Abdullah Azzam, the leader of the foreign fighters in Afghanistan, came to the United States. He did tours. They did TV shows, like local cable access TV shows. They got the message out. They were able to recruit. Jonestown, is a cult that famously ended in a terrible massacre, got a couple hundred Americans out of the United States and to Guyana based on a sort of crazy ideology and led them to their deaths. No internet. In one area that I've been looking at, particularly in recent years, is sort of this anti-communist publishing houses that were operating in the United States through the 50s and 60s. So the John Birch Society, rabid anti-communist society that really incubated a lot of other domestic U.S. extremist movements. They published so much stuff. Newsletters, books, their catalog is unbelievably huge. There's a company called Omni Publications that is really the key vector through which a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories became popularized in the United States and in Europe in the 50s and 60s, and they still exist. They actually have a website now, and they're selling these same old books from like 1935 about the money conspiracy. So in some ways, this isn't new. Extremist groups will always go to the best technology that's available to them affordably, and they'll use it. So, but something's changed, right? So we all sense this. We're having conferences about this that weren't being had 30 years ago, 40 years ago. There's way more of us studying this issue now. And ISIS is really, come to be emblematic of this change as the big problem that we're all obsessed with solving and figuring out how to deal with what they're doing online. So this change comes from a couple of different factors. It's a pretty complicated arena, but there are 4 things that are really fundamentally different for an extremist group trying to recruit in the internet age. So the first is security. So, I was reading Soldier of Fortune magazine. If I had questions about, becoming a white nationalist fighter in Rhodesia, as they were often soliciting for in the pages of that magazine, I would have had to go talk to some dodgy people about that. And, people who are violent, potentially dangerous, heavily armed, people I might, 12-year-old me might have been a little nervous about doing that. In fact, 12-year-old me would have been nervous about doing that, so nervous that I wouldn't have done it. Online, you can start talking to a violent extremist without exposing yourself to physical risk. So instead of having to really take that first step into danger before you're exposed to an ideology and radicalization and recruitment and all the stuff that we've been talking about over these 2 days, you had to be committed enough that you were willing to take at least one risky step of talking to somebody who is potentially dangerous. And now you can talk to that person, freely. You can get online. You can start talking to them on Twitter. You don't have to disclose your own identity. You don't have to disclose where you are. And you can get to know the person before you take the risk. So you can get comfortable with the person on the other end of this spectrum. And that's a big deal. You're going to hear all the arguments, the same arguments you would have heard before, but your barrier to entry is much lower. So you don't have to take that physical step. Discovery. So I'm using the phrase that William Gibson popularized. It's faster than meat space. Cyberspace, you can find the people you're looking for. You have a variety of tools to locate people who share your interests. As opposed to, my radical druid in Peoria, what's he going to do? He's going to have to go to Ireland, to find somebody who's likely to share his interests. Now you get online, and if you find one account that shares your interests, then Twitter and Facebook and Google will recommend lots of other stuff that reflects that. So if you create a Twitter account, follow one jihadist, it will give you 20 jihadist recommendations. You don't even have to do the work yourself. It will be served up to you. So discovery is radically different than it used to be. You don't have to send a recruiter out in meat space to shake hands and potentially be exposed, potentially get arrested. Maybe they're going to get thrown out of the mosque that they're trying to recruit in. All these complications just suddenly fall away, and the process of finding people who share your interests has become dramatically, exponentially simpler. Remote intimacy. This is something that I sort of experienced myself and really started to appreciate after I was corresponding with Omar Hamami, the American who joined al-Shabaab. I had interviewed him initially because he broke with al-Shabaab and he was, mounting a criticism of them, and I wanted to find out more about that. So I interviewed him on email, and then he got onto Twitter to promote his plight that al-Shabaab was going to kill him for speaking out. And he was repeatedly trying to engage with me on Twitter, so finally I didn't want to talk to him in public at first because I didn't want to publicize his, ideology. So I started direct messaging with him, and this continued for almost a year, intermittently, but pretty consistently. And so at some point in this process, I realized, like, there's a human being on the other side of this, and I feel like I know this guy. And it's not the same as knowing somebody in real life, but it feels the same. I have colleagues who I work with online who I've met in the real world once or twice, but I talk to them online every day, and there's a feeling of intimacy with them. I feel like I can trust them. I feel like I know them. So you don't have to be in the same place as the recruiter or the fighter or the person who has the ideology. You can feel a really intimate relationship with somebody over social media. In some ways, it can feel a little more intimate than real. When you're talking to somebody on Twitter, on direct messages, on talking to somebody on Telegram, how they look doesn't matter, how they smell doesn't matter, whether they're, leaning in too close or standing too far back. A lot of stuff just sort of drops away. It's just really an exchange of words. And so this is powerful, and it was more powerful than I think, I would have guessed if you went back 10 years and looked at this question. And then finally, the speed of contagion. So I think that this is something that we're only really beginning to see and understand. And the example I like to think about in this is, if you look at early Christianity, in the very earliest days of Christianity, Christianity was very apocalyptic orientation to its religion. Can you still hear me over the construction? So Christianity, if you look at the earliest scriptures, the earliest things that were written, it's very apocalyptic in nature. And it spread for what at the time was a very fast pace around the Middle East and into Rome. But fast for its time was about 3 centuries. And in that 3 centuries, a lot of things can happen. So there were pressures to moderate, essentially. The apocalyptic piece started to fade because there were a lot of people who expected the end of the world was coming in 45, 50 AD. When that didn't happen, things had to adjust. You started to get social structures around it. You started to have bishops. You had constituencies that were arguing about what, exactly what do we believe and what are our practices. And eventually you had a authority figure who came in and sort of consolidated everything. So the ideas spread very quickly for the day, but not faster than the ideas could evolve. So even as the ideas are spreading, they're evolving. And to some extent, this is like the game of telephone, right? So, you whisper something in a person's ear, they whisper it to the next person, you go across the room, and it's completely different when it gets out on the other end. All this oral transmission over long periods of time naturally causes changes in the topic that's being discussed. ISIS comes up with its version of this ideology, which has gone through some evolution in the years prior to this, but the version that ISIS presented was able to spread globally much faster than it could change. So in its original form, it's everywhere suddenly. So there's the evolutionary process, which I think, there are people here who are probably better qualified to comment on this than me, but I think that, the evolutionary process is going to push toward moderation and sustainability. I mean, evolution fundamentally pushes toward sustainability. And ISIS was able to spread globally in 2 years with virtually no evolution. So what we have is that ideas are traveling much faster than they can evolve, and that favors fringe ideas. So all of these things, everybody, especially in policy circles, I'm sure you've experienced this frustration in talking to people in policy circles, treats ISIS as if it's very special. And, it is special in the sense that they were first. They came up with the idea to really, go out and automate their social media, to synchronize it. The people who were behind their social media campaign understood how social media works in a period where everybody else is still trying to catch up. None of this stuff is exclusive to ISIS's ideology. There's nothing special about ISIS that makes it a unique example of how these ideas will spread and propagate. They're just first. And we're already seeing that other groups are starting to emulate what they're doing, in lesser and greater ways. And that's what we're sort of moving toward. That's the post-ISIS challenge, is how are we going to deal with those groups? So the group that is most obviously emulating ISIS's tactics on social media is white nationalists. What you're seeing here is a graph of a particular subset of white nationalism. It's Twitter followers of accounts that are based on real-life organizations. So they have some kind of offline component in the United States. So it's a very limited set. But what we've seen is that that set has grown explosively over the last 6 years. I did a study in 2012 on this group. I repeated it without publishing in 2014 just to see what was going on. And we'll be publishing, GWU will be publishing something soon on the current state. These guys are exploding onto social media. The current size of the network is bigger and it's more active than ISIS at its peak. There are a couple of reasons for that. They don't have the same suspension pressures primarily. So let's go to the next slide. So a few things set the stage for this. So white nationalists had been, pushed out of public discourse in the United States, pretty aggressively. By the 1970s, it was remarkably uncool to be a white nationalist. In the 80s and the early 90s, they tried to rebrand themselves as neo-Nazis and skinheads and try and recapture some coolness. And they were the ISIS to, Ku Klux Klan was AlQaeda and neo-Nazis were ISIS. Similar kind of evolution at a much smaller scale. But they really couldn't get any traction because, a lot of these values had just been completely pushed out of the mainstream. So a lot of that suppression of that content originated with the mainstream media. Mainstream media was more progressive than the regular population. They started putting out content that said, made a judgment about racism. You had Archie Bunker and the Mod Squad and, a million different things, a million different ways that message was reinforced. If you were a neo-Nazi, you were not going to get a TV show. So the only TV show about Nazis that was succeeding in this period was Hogan's Heroes, and that was an aberration. The news, which is the most important part of a political movement, is access to news. And the news was dominated by people who were opposed to white nationalism. So these gatekeepers really forced the movement into the shadows. They were required to do their business in secret. They would hold camping trips in the South. And they started using the internet in its earliest form. So they had bulletin boards, dial-up bulletin boards back in the 80s. And they had a lot of, they basically followed every trend. So they got onto forums, message-protected forums. They got into any online function that they could find, and all of that stuff is great, but it's only you're talking to a closed community. It's really just the people who are going to bother to sign up for Stormfront is who you're talking to. You're not reaching a wider audience. So when we think about how this is going to affect things going forward, it may dismay you to hear this, given that everybody here has been working on this problem for years and experiencing great frustration. ISIS is the easy problem. So ISIS was doing its work at massive volume, so it's easy to detect, and it pushing the boundaries of the terms of service, both in the types of content they use and the types of activity they took part in, the automation they used. They're breaking the rules left and right. Getting these guys off of social media is a relatively easy task because they're breaking the rules. They're putting out incredibly graphic violence. They're making specific threats of violence, but most importantly, they have no base of support in any mainstream society. Even in Saudi Arabia, there's not a mainstream base of support. So nobody in Saudi Arabia is going to like march down to City Hall with protest signs saying, please don't suspend ISIS on social media. Some of them will resent it privately, but they're not going to do it in public. There is no constituency for ISIS. That doesn't apply to everybody else. So, you know, white nationalism, as we are unfortunately experiencing, both in the United States and in the UK and broadly in Europe, white nationalism has a constituency, and they are able to blur the lines and really present themselves in ways that do not violate the terms of service and create a more legitimate free speech problem. So, you know, an organization or a government is going to be much slower to try and stamp out white nationalist sentiment than they are with ISIS. So all the resources that we have on ISIS are not available for every other fringe group that's coming up. So this leads to a couple of complicated calculations. We got freedom of speech, which I just touched on. We're seeing the mainstreaming of these movements, which I just touched on. The more mainstream they are, the harder it is to push back on them on social media. We have a corporatocracy, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute. That just means that the decisions about what is acceptable speech are being made by companies and largely not by societies. And we have a bias in enforcement. So ISIS, if you're an ISIS supporter at this point, you're on social media, you're living in fear. You're going to be gone any minute. And if you're a white nationalist, you have to be pretty egregious to get off. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, after thinking about this for a long time, I feel that this is going to have dramatic implications for where we go as a society over the next 10 or 20 years. I think because social media favors identity, you can use an identity marker on your avatar, you can find identity groups very easily. I think we're looking at a massive social reorganization. I think identity groups are going to come back with a vengeance. It is going to be difficult to stop them because when you are focused on an identity group or an extremist belief, you're a monomaniac, and social media structurally favors monomaniacs. They favors people who will go on every day and tweet the same thing every day and bother people and not be discouraged. So there's a huge structural bias toward people who have these fringe views and antisocial views. And so we're entering an age of what we're seeing with ISIS is a super empowered super minority. Tiny fraction of all the people in the world who can create a gigantic problem, who can kill a lot of people, who can paralyze economies, who can paralyze regions. So where does this go? So there are a couple of possible outcomes. The best case is that we quickly evolve tools that reinforce the resilient center, right? So good people get online and they tweet, bring back our girls, but they don't tweet it for a day and then go home. They like keep tweeting it and they keep doing things on social media that promote the center. I don't think that's likely to happen, but it could. Another thing that could happen is that new social platforms will arise that are structured differently, that don't reward monomania in the same way. That's somewhat more possible. Regardless, there's some of these effects I'm going to talk about we're still going to see at least for a while because this isn't going to happen overnight. We're going to have to get lucky and it's going to take time. The worst case scenario is that we're going to see mass migrations along identity lines, religion, race. We're going to see people do what they're doing with ISIS is they pick up and move and they go and gather in physical meet space with people who share their ideas that they were able to find online. And again, it's micro percentages. It's like 0.001% of all white people decide they're going to move to the Pacific Northwest and start a white supremacist paradise. That's a huge disruption. That's a huge, huge problem. So, I mean, it's going to push towards separatism. We're going to see escalating violence as these movements become more empowered and also as they push back on each other. And we're going to see wars and revolutions because foreign fighters always bring terrible, terrible problems in the places they go. The middle road would be we make sporadic progress with occasional viral outbreaks of extremism. So ISIS is one viral outbreak. The rising tide of white nationalism is another. But ultimately, we're sort of like making progress, and we manage to diffuse these situations before they turn into all-out wars, civil wars. You know, we get skirmishes instead of gigantic battles. In the middle road, we get these outbreaks concurrently instead of getting, we get them consecutively instead of concurrently. So we have one problem, and then we move on to the next problem. And then we move on to the next problem. Instead of 10 problems popping up at the same time, let's see a show of hands how many people think we're going to get lucky and have them be one at a time. Anybody? Yeah. So the middle road is not, you know, we can hope for it, but I'm not optimistic. I think we're probably going to be looking at the worst case scenario. So that brings us to the final point, which is that how do we deal with this? How are we going to go about countering this problem and understanding it? And the first big obstacle, and really the biggest obstacle, is that social media is a corporatocracy. So we're not talking about a real public square. These are companies that own these platforms and control what's on these platforms. And they carry out enforcement against the users of these platforms every day in volumes that they do not disclose and for reasons that they do not disclose. So we don't know how many people get suspended on any given day on any of these platforms, and we don't know why. And we don't know the demographics of who's being suspended and whether there's some kind of bias at play in there. This is a tremendous challenge in trying to come up with this broad solution to this problem. White nationalists may have an easier time of it than black nationalists. I'm guessing, you know, if you tried to put in some kind of enforcement policy against each of these groups, I'm guessing that black nationalists would probably have a harder time keeping their accounts online, you know, and there are a variety of ways that bias can creep into this. So nobody wants a world where, you know, Google, Facebook, and Twitter are deciding what's acceptable morality and what's acceptable speech. But that's the world we have. And as these platforms become increasingly important, increasingly part of the public discourse, this problem is only going to get worse. They also operate in global jurisdictions, so different countries have different standards. This gets to be an incredibly complicated problem. None of these companies want to work with government in a really active way for reasons that are laudable, but it's still, you know, when you sit down and we're going to try and figure out how to solve this problem, that's a real challenge. So ultimately, there is no obvious solution at this time to all of this, and that's why I tend to think we're going to see the worst case scenario. I think we're in for a rough 10 years with a lot of violence and a lot of turmoil, and I think the best thing we can do is not be surprised by it. So this is why I'm being the prophet of doom today. So I would now be happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much. So yeah, now we're going to take a couple of questions. We've got about 20 minutes. We're already running over. Could I please ask you, before you ask your question, can you wait for the microphone and also give your name and affiliation? Okay. So,
Yeah, thank you. Michael Fürstenberg from the Max Planck Institute in Halle in Germany. You mentioned, or you showed that other extremist groups are now learning, obviously, from the ISIS that was like the first who did this as an innovative behavior, and you mentioned white extremist groups. And I would more specifically question about the AlQaeda. So what did, you know, the broader jihadist movement, so to speak, so what did they learn, and are they certainly maybe it's more a problem because they represent like they can represent the myth of the broader, like the more mainstream alternative, and ISIS, okay, they're clearly fringe, but yeah, you know, we're like representing real issues after a rebellion. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so Al-Qaeda has learned from ISIS somewhat. They have
taken tentative steps to sort of use some of the same techniques that ISIS has used in terms of automation, in terms of synchronization. But Al-Qaeda is culturally averse to social media, partly because they are in constant danger of being droned. ISIS doesn't worry about that so much, and it turns out that until recently they were correct not to worry about it so much. So we see al-Nusra has a significant presence, but they're not doing the same kind of synchronized stuff. But they are benefiting. So they're benefiting, but they're benefiting in a more organic way and not in the same sort of obvious sudden escalation that we saw with ISIS. White nationalists are really more emulating the ISIS approach now. But what they do is they don't, their content, they're not posting graphically violent content most of the time. And they're not, some of them are careful about not violating the terms of service, so they're able to stay online and organize in a much better way. But they're running hashtag campaigns, they're doing automation, they have recruitment programs that run inside a broader social network in the same way that ISIS does. So, those kinds of specific tactics are being exploited now. And then the beauty of all this, of course, is these are super complicated systems, so you have an emergence problem, which is that, 2 months from now, somebody's going to figure out how to, organize a chain of tweets that becomes self-aware or something else that we fail to anticipate. So I worry about that a little more than a continuation of the things we've seen so far.
Any other questions? Wait.
My name is
Oh.
Moin Khawaja from DC University. My question for you is, how do we treat propaganda by other Islamist organizations which are equally deadly as ISIS? For example, Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Islamiyya, and many others in Iraq and Syria, in Libya, or in Afghanistan. You have ISIS in Afghanistan as well. Should that propaganda be treated as seriously as it is being treated in terms of ISIS, or what should be the approach to it?
Well, that's a good question. It's a difficult question. So, we're currently looking at an incredibly complicated jihadi landscape right now. And right now, decisions are being made very ad hoc. So the Taliban, for instance, has been online on social media forever without any real significant pressure being put on them except sporadically. Jabhat al-Nusra is in the position of being part of this rebel coalition, and so there's some ambivalence in the Western governments about what are we going to do about it, whereas in the Gulf governments are completely enthusiastic about Jabhat al-Nusra. Al-Nusra could also break with Al-Qaeda. This is obviously, anybody who follows Al-Nusra knows that every 2 weeks there's a story saying that they're going to break with Al-Qaeda, and it never happens. But it's a logical move for them, and you kind of have to think that sooner or later that's probably going to happen. So then what do you do with them? Do we draw the line there? Do we draw it at Ahrar al-Sham? I don't have easy answers for all of these things. The thing about ISIS as a geopolitical actor is that it is, a connoisseur of chaos. It is actively trying to disrupt everything in the region and everything outside of the region in ways that are so aggressive that you can't tolerate them, which is why they have gotten the crackdown that they have. With these other groups, then you start to get into these sticky areas, and the companies, I mean, to some extent, I think I'm sort of making a criticism of these companies in this speech because they have become, not really through any fault of their own, they've become the de facto dictators of free speech around the world. Companies don't like gray areas, so ISIS is easy, Jabhat al-Nusra is harder, Ahrar al-Sham is harder still, and each of these things that comes up, I think that it's going to be more and more difficult to do a suppression campaign like has been done against ISIS. So I think that, it'll depend on what kind of propaganda they're putting out and what they're doing, but, there's no formula for this, I think, that you can apply to these new generation of other extremist groups that are going to be using the medium.
Masa?
Marcel Worring, University of Amsterdam, and part of VOX-Pol. So you're indicating it's only a very small part of the social media, it's 0.002%. That's still a huge amount of data, a lot of unstructured data. So how do you deal with that?
Well, my experience has been that if you know a few accounts that are in the particular extremist movement that you're looking at, that you can find a lot more accounts. And that when you find a lot more accounts, then you can find maybe almost all the accounts. So I think that, you know, a failing in particularly in how governments approach this has been to do, they want a top-down solution. So they want to be able to load the internet up in their browser and press a button and all the extremists will pop out of the internet. Whereas what's much more practical is that you do some manual identification of your initial actors and then you snowball your networks out. So once you have that, one advantage that we do have in this that I think I glossed over because I was running out of time is that trend detection is much easier in an age of social media. This is an incredibly powerful tool that we really have not exploited fully. And you know, I speak from the experience of, you know, one reason I got to work on a book on ISIS is that I saw them coming on social media before I saw them coming on the ground. And you know, you could see the rift with AlQaeda was particularly really the thing that first interested me in ISIS. I was like, wow, you know, forum administrators who have Twitter accounts are suddenly switching their allegiance. And then when you looked at you spin out their social network and you see that more and more people around that network are also switching their allegiance. And so there's a lot of really cool stuff we can be doing with trend detection that I think we're only at the beginning of. So, you know, being forewarned is good. In some cases it'll help, in other cases it may not. But I think that's you know, the utility of this data, aside from identifying individual bad guys, is really to sort of not get flabbergasted every time one of these things comes up. So, you know, in 2014, you know, we're subjected to an endless series of stories about ISIS coming out of nowhere. That helps ISIS when they're perceived as coming out of nowhere. So, you know, the more we can anticipate and educate people about what's going to happen, the lesser the impact will be.
But if I understand it correctly, if you talk about trends, it's basically the number of followers or the kind of easy statistics other than what's in the text, what kind of images are there, what are they using as images, how are they spread, those kind of things. Or are you also taking those into account?
No, I'm talking about that whole spectrum of things. So, I mean, you know, in terms of what I found is that you can, if you have a good set of people who are interested in a certain topic, so say they're tweeting white genocide, if you collect the people around those people, this is just one example of the way I approach things, and everybody else here has a lot of great ideas on this too. But I don't, you know, I look at those people who are tweeting white genocide, and then I collect everybody who's following them, and then I look at what other hashtags they're tweeting, and then I try and figure out where the overlapping networks are. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can do extracting value from text. I'm not a big fan of semantic and sentiment analysis, but I do like word pairs and collocation and, you know, word frequency kind of stuff is stuff that's very basic, but it gives you some idea of what's going on. I don't have the cool image technology that we saw on display here, but I think that's another really interesting way to approach it. So, you know, our ability to process, get intelligence out of the data is only going to improve as this goes on, and so, you know, that's a bright spot in this.
So VOX-Pol might bring some new things to you.
Yes, I learned stuff.
Anyone else? Oh, yes, please. Over here. Oh. Yeah.
Hi, Ece Özkan, Facebook. So my question is more around separatism, separatist movements. So you know that in Turkey there is PKK. Obviously they are fighting against ISIS, there is also YPG. But the government is sort of fighting both against them and ISIS. So how do you see this as a worst case outcome for, let's say, either for Turkey or for EU, because basically Turkey is the sort of the hub, like between, like sort of like the border between ISIS and rest.
Well, I mean, I'm not a regional politics expert, but even I can see that Kurdish separatism is going to be a big issue in the post-ISIS environment. And, you know, there's a lot of political opposition to it. At the same time, the United States has been, you know, really liking how the Kurds are taking on ISIS. And so, you know, I don't know what kind of understandings they might have behind the scenes on that. And I'm not, you know, I wear a lot of hats, but regional politics expert is not one of them. So certainly I can see enough to be concerned about it. And the PKK is very good at Twitter, by the way. So, but I don't think I can comment on that intelligently enough to.
Anyone else? Yes, over here.
Laura Smith, BBC Monitoring. Just perhaps on the day of the UK referendum outcome, I can't quite deal with the bigger picture doom and gloom.
I know, I felt bad because I knew everybody was already going to be in a pretty gloomy mood coming in here.
But just so on the sort of wider implications that you're drawing from online activity and the sort of nature of fringe society, fringe community impact, isn't it the case that IS, the impact of IS actually comes from the impact it's made on the ground in real terms? And it wasn't the internet activity that came first. So just aren't there many sort of factors, real life factors, including that favour the status quo, including the sort of people in charge and the corporatocracy that you referred to? Don't lots of things actually sort of militate for a sort of more sane outcome than you suggest? Please say yes.
Well, the on-the-ground situation in Iraq, certainly. I mean, you know, offline pieces of this are hugely important. And I don't mean to minimize that. What I think is that the input coming from the social media networked places is going to take volatile situations and make them more volatile. And I think you can make a pretty good case for that with IS. You know, I guess that's kind of, you know, the best, the least depressing way I can probably put that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for one more question. Oh.
Hi, Serena Tieno, Netherlands Data Analytics. Thank you for your talk. I would like to go back to the topic of the white nationalism. You said the problem there is that their communication is on blurred lines. How do we go around that? So, except for the responsibility of the corporations, how do you tackle that point?
Yeah, that's the problem. So, with the white nationalists, there are certainly organized efforts at this point that do break the rules, you know, that do violate the terms of service. So, you know, I'm sure most of you know that I've been, you know, a big advocate of suspensions on the ISIS networks for a long time. And with white nationalists, there is activity that can and should be suspended because it's like direct harassment. It's threats, physical threats, you know, organized campaigns of harassment that have driven people off of Twitter. A number of journalists have written about that. If you, you know, I think the companies could approach the question of organized harassment in a more effective way. There might be a way to draw lines around organized harassment that would give you some tools to moderate activity on these networks. The problem is a lot of white nationalists online will take a line, and you know, you can question the sincerity of this ideological point they're making, and I do question the sincerity of it, that they just simply love their own people, and you know, they don't hate anybody, and blah blah blah. And you know, I think you look at these networks, if you are unfortunate to spend any time reading into them, you can quickly see that that's not true. But when you're a person who's in, all human beings are still making all the decisions about suspensions, with very few exceptions, like very gross automated behavior might get automatically suspended by a company. But otherwise, a human being is reading this content and making the call. So if you're, you get a report, somebody's got a swastika or they got the white power logo on their thing, and but the person's content is like, oh, well, I just love my people, and it gets to be a gray area. Then you have an additional complication, which is that, and we see this in the Donald Trump campaign in the United States, and we saw it with Brexit, is that white nationalists are mainstreaming themselves. So they're leveraging issues that are close to them to become part of the mainstream conversation. And then you get into the question of, so we already are uncomfortable, right, with Facebook, Google, and Twitter being the morality police. Are we uncomfortable with them doing social engineering? Are they, because that's the next thing. It's like, when are we drawing the line between stopping a violent extremist group and socially engineering communities to make a better world in their vision of it? And any fan of dystopian fiction will tell you that it never ends well. So I don't have the answers to that. I have the questions, and I'm throwing them out here to this group of smart people, and hopefully see some more conversation about this that will help inform my own thinking.
Okay. Thank you very much for the questions and your attention. I'm going to close the session now. I believe we're having lunch, and I'd like you to join me again in thanking Jay and Berger for an excellent talk.